All right. Thanks to McKenna and the staff here at Upper Room. I really appreciate the emphasis that trying to make families a priority. It is a challenge to function in a healthy way as a family these days. There are so many pressures on our kids, on parents, that it really is a challenging time, I think. So trying to give you some tools. I approach this in a very humble way. What I'm trying to present to you tonight is based on my experience as a psychologist, over 40 years practice, and teaching and studying the Bible over 40 years. And so as we go through this, I want you to feel free to ask questions as we go. What we're going to do is tonight, the title is Parenting with Grace and Truth. And I'll explain a little bit of that to start with and what that means. And then we're going to talk about the grace aspect of parenting tonight. And then next week, we're going to talk about how to stay calm as a parent. It's really important to keep your composure. Kids can test that. I mean, they can frustrate you as quick as anything and anyone. And so we'll talk about some coping skills and problem solving for you as parents that I think is important next week. And then the third week, we're going to talk about very specific behavior management techniques. And part of that will also include some attitudes that I think is important to carry into parenting as part of that. And then the fourth week, we're going to do a parent and teen combination and see how that goes. So as we go through this, feel free to, ask questions, and I don't mind being interrupted, and if it's something we're going to cover later on, I'll talk about that. So, all right. So parenting with grace and truth. This idea comes from John 1:14, and this is a description of Jesus. He was filled with grace and truth. And what this means is that you can be kind, at the same time speak truth. And truth is really important. As human beings, the one thing my profession taught me in my over 40 years was the amazing ability of human beings to rationalize and justify their behavior. And the people who taught me this the most were sex offenders. For a while, I evaluated sex offenders, and this goes back a long way, but it was incredible, their versions of what happened. And as I was sitting across from them, it was like, do you hear yourself? But I became convicted that these people really believed what they were telling me. They were not lying to me. They were lying to themselves first and then telling me what they had come to believe. And from that, it kind of dawned on me, I do the same thing. If I want to eat Krispy Kreme donuts, I can rationalize it. I can justify it in the moment. And so that's part of, the need for grace, is that we're going to talk about all of us are sinners because none of us are perfect. And that's a good thing. We don't feel like we have to be, but we'll get into that later on. So another good scripture is Proverbs 3:12. For the Lord disciplines the one he loves, just as a father the son he delights in. So what's the motivation for discipline? Love. It's not anger. It's not frustration. You discipline out of love, and you delight in your children. And that can be a challenge sometimes. But it's The idea of discipline is the word teach. Disciple is teacher. And so as a parent, when you discipline, you're teaching, you're training, and that's the concept of this. So what does it mean to parent with grace and truth? Josh McDowell, in a book, How to Be a Hero to Your Kids, wrote, rules without relationship equals rebellion. And I would add, relationship without rules equals rebellion. The hardest part of parenting is the balancing the relationship and the rules part of parenting, the grace and the truth. The grace part is the relationship, the truth is the accountability, the rules, responsibility, those kinds of things. And so as a parent, there are times where we say, oh man, I'm being too hard on my child. Or there's other times where I got to crack down on them, I'm letting them get away with murder. And you go back and forth, and finding this balance, I find to be the most difficult thing of being a parent. The good news is that if you stop and question yourself, you're in a good position. I decided several years ago that tension is a good thing. That if I am certain that I'm not being too hard on my child, I'm showing them a lot of grace, and this is a good thing, and I don't ever question whether I'm hard enough, I probably got blinders on. And so when you have a tension and you question yourself, am I really doing this the right way? Then that's a good thing. As parents, we do not have a crystal ball that we can look into and say, this is absolutely the right way to do things. There are so many theories out there of parenting, so many books. You go to any of the bookstores, online, there are just multiple theories of parenting. I personally think some of them are really bad. And I'll share what I think is effective and to go with. So from this idea that rules without relationship equals rebellion and relationship without rules equals rebellion, we have this quadrant here. And if you look at the top left, distant and lenient. And so this is the parent who doesn't want to be involved. Doesn't care what their child does as long as it doesn't interfere with what they're doing. And then you go over to the right, top right, you have distant and strict. This is more of the authoritarian, do what I tell you, don't ask questions, that approach. And then the bottom left is close and lenient. Any idea what the motivation there is? I want to be your friend, I want your approval. And then the bottom right is strict and close. And if you go extreme with this can be over-controlling, making decisions for kids, which is not a good thing. This pointer doesn't work on the TV, but probably, whoa. In that quadrant, if you go in toward the center, that's probably the ideal. What we see with healthy adults and kids is the adult kids who are successful and have a healthy relationship with their parents tends to be in that kind of strict, close, but up toward the center, not in an extreme way. So, what are some ways we can work on the relationship with our children? Spend positive time with your child. Philippians 2:14-15, do everything without grumbling and arguing so that you may be blameless and pure, children of God who are faultless in a crooked and perverted generation, among whom you shine like stars in the world. You want to spend time with your kids, not teaching, not asking questions. If you are teaching and asking questions, the message is something's wrong with you. So you want to spend time just describing what they enjoy doing, what they spend their time doing. And it's more of like in a sports television, when they're broadcasting television on sports on television, there is a play-by-play who just describes the play. There's no evaluation. It's just observation. And so you spend time with your kids, and it's important to have that time. The biggest mistake that I see parents make in my last few years, actually quite a few years in working with families, was parents talk too much. They want to talk their kids into wanting to do what the parents want them to do. And that's unrealistic. And so spending time where not everything you do is a teachable moment. Give your kids a break. Let them just kind of relax and breathe and not feel like they have to be learning, and you just spend time with them, observing. Now, there is a time for discipline, accountability, and that. We will talk about that. But remember the balance, the relationship. In order to get compliance with rules, you've got to have a relationship. If you try to enforce rules without the relationship, you're going to get rebellion. It's just the way it works. Know what your child is interested in and talk about those things. Your child is going to go through so many different stages. My son, when he was young, wanted to work on the garbage truck. And back then, it was the guy who rode on the back and emptied it, and he wanted to be that guy. He didn't want to drive it. He wanted to ride on the back. And then he wanted, we had some power out, and the lineman came out, and then he wanted to ride the cherry up and work on the lines. And so kids are going to go through a lot of different things. Don't react to everything that happens. Just simply be empathetic, describe it, and let them talk about those things. Kids are going to talk about unrealistic things. Teenagers will talk about unrealistic things. One of the things to keep in mind, the frontal cortex of the brain associated with delayed gratification, decision-making, problem-solving, coping skills, all of those things does not fully develop till you're 25 to 30 years of age, roughly. So your child's brain is still developing, and that greatly influences the decision-making. Think back to your own teen years and some of the decisions you made that you survived. Yeah, we all have those moments. That's part of it. So, your kids will talk about things, listen. If it is totally off the wall, you can have conversations about it, but just be careful. Have those moments where you're not teaching. You're just developing that relationship. You're building the relationship. Be authentic and truthful. Children, especially teens, hate hypocrisy. If you ask a teen what they hate the most, it's probably a hypocrite, a fake. And because of that, it is so important that you be real with your child. The parent who, going back to the quadrant, who is lenient and close, trying to get the child to like them, a lot of times the child's going to see through that it's just kind of manipulation. So be yourself, be truthful, be who you are. It doesn't mean that you have to be judgmental of the other person. Again, the idea of grace and truth. You know, if I talked to all of you long enough, we probably would disagree on something. It doesn't mean we can't be nice to each other or do things together or be friends. And so same thing with your teen. Sometimes there's going to be differences. What's the primary developmental task of the teen years? It's becoming independent. If they don't accomplish that, they're going to be living with you when they're 40 years old. I hope most of you don't want that. So, you know, it's really important to be authentic and so forth. And part of this process is minimize unsolicited advice. There are times where you just listen. Matthew 7:6, do not give dogs what is sacred, do not throw your pearls to pigs. If you do, they may trample them under their feet and then turn and tear you to pieces. I take that and apply pearls of wisdom. I have a website, and it's on the front of the notes there, and one of the blogs is on this verse. And it's not about judgment, it's about advice giving and being careful with that. And so there are times where, and especially one of the rules I set for myself for my adult children was to do my best to never give advice unless it was asked for. And that has really helped the relationship. And it is very difficult to do sometimes. Sometimes you have to bite your tongue and let the blood trickle down. It is very difficult. But I think it is very important in terms of building that relationship. You build the relationship so that when you do say something, it has credibility. If you're always giving them the truth, giving advice, and those kinds of things, you lose your credibility. Be empathetic to your child's feelings and hold them accountable for their behavior. This is, again, grace and truth. Empathy for emotions, accountability for behavior. I understand you don't want to take out the garbage. However, if you don't take out the garbage, you're going to have whatever consequence you decide is appropriate for your child. Yeah. Sometimes we want our child to like doing something, and that's an unrealistic expectation. If it is the fourth quarter of a football game and it's real close and I'm really into it, and my wife asks me to do something at that moment, she may not get the best response. Why would you expect your teen, your child, to do the same thing? If they're in the middle of something they're really entrenched in, and you say, go do this, you may not get the best response. Now, is it important they go do it if you ask them to? Absolutely. But do they have to like it? You know, allow the eye roll, whatever it may be, the nonverbal, as long as there's compliance with the behavior. And you can avoid a lot of conflict with that. Give them space when they are upset. Sometimes it's important just to let them have some space. They're upset. Job 6:26, do you think that you can disprove my words, or that a despairing man's words are mere wind? Timing is so important. There's a time to talk, and there's a time to be quiet and listen. And make sure you are intentional about making that decision. Is this a time that I just need to listen? Or is this a time where I need to have a conversation? Or do I need to listen first, then have the conversation? Be brief and concise. If you talk over 10 seconds, you're probably lecturing. in the mind of your teenager. And we want to give them all these reasons why they need to want to do this. And unfortunately, in the conversation, the more you talk and the more they don't listen, what happens to your frustration? And then you yell. That's often the sequence that we see and follow. Be polite even when they are not. This is a hard one. Ephesians 4:29, no foul language is to come from your mouth, but only what is good for building up someone in need so that it gives grace to those who hear. Again, the idea here is we're working on the grace part of it. We'll talk about the truth part of it, and that's important. But right now we're just talking about that, building that relationship, and that is just so important. You can present the truth, but you cannot make them believe. And we've already talked about Job 6:26. Yeah. What people desire is more powerful than facts. That's a paraphrase of a quote from Winston Churchill. And so keep in mind that we all are irrational. We're going to talk about the irrational parent. Obviously, if you have a teenager, you've seen irrationality in action. Just out of curiosity, how many of you have teens and how many have elementary or, okay, so, all right. So I try to differentiate some of the responses because I do believe kind of up to 12, there's one process, and after that, there's another. And I'll give you kind of the brief overview is that essentially I think in the early years, what you're trying to establish is compliance. They're going to do what you ask them to. They're going to do what their teacher asks them to. They're going to do what their church member asks them to. And so you get compliance. And then in the teen years, you work on communication, negotiation, compromise, those types of skills that you add to it. But if you don't have the compliance aspect and you have rebellion, then it's very difficult to engage in the others. So I really believe, and I don't have any data to back me up on this, but I just, through the years of watching families, of creating that that expectation of compliance is really important. I have two kids. One was easy to raise. You say, don't do that, she'd stop. And then I had a son who you say, don't do that, and he said, why not? And he was ADHD and impulsive, and so just two different types of kids, and it's important to understand the differences in your kids. One may be compliant and easygoing, but the other one may challenge you. And hopefully some of the things that we talk about will be helpful with that. Solve the problem rather than reacting emotionally. So your child brings home some bad grades. I mean, this is a story with my ADHD son. He brought home some really bad grades, and fortunately he wasn't home, so I couldn't ground him for 6 years. And I had time to calm down and think about, I don't even know why he's making bad grades. And so if I don't know why he's making bad grades, how can I help resolve the problem? And so got to checking, and his test grades were great, but he was missing assignments. And he would not write down the assignment, forget to do the assignment, whatever. Think for a minute, how many steps are involved in completing a homework assignment? First of all, you've got to know what the assignment is. You've got to hear the teacher give the assignment or know where to go online to get it. Then you've got to remember to get whatever materials you need from school to home if that's necessary. Then you've got to remember to do it. Then you've got to have all the resources, a pen, a paper, a book, a handout, whatever it may be, to do it. Then you got to do it. Then you got to get it some way back to school, put it somewhere so you remember to take it back to school. Then you got to, once you get it to school, you got to remember to turn it in. Any one of these steps can result in an incomplete homework assignment. The assumption so often is that it's always motivational. And a lot of times, in fact, I will even venture to say most of the time, it's not. It's a kid is forgetting, they're not organized, there's some skills deficit that they need in order to work on that. With my son, he just really disorganized, ADHD, pretty typical. So we set up a program where he had a planner, had to write something for every subject, no homework or what the homework assignment was. And if he comes home and it's not complete, then no electronics for the rest of the day. And my wife or I would check it and look at it, and you could see sometimes you'd say, well, do you have math? And no, it's done. And say, well, what's this? And you could tell he was looking at it like, he genuinely didn't remember and was frustrated with himself when he saw that, okay, I've got this assignment. And within 2 to 3 weeks, he was using the planner, and only once or twice did he lose electronics. And after that, he got on board, was finishing it. Even in high school, he was still using the planner. After a while, we didn't have to check it. And so you need to find out kind of what the problem is. It's important to problem. You can yell and scream and assume it's motivational, but you're probably not going to get the results that you're trying to accomplish. Be forgiving. None of us are perfect. We're all sinners. And so you put 2 sinners together, good chance something's going to get messed up. And be willing to say, I'm sorry when you make a mistake, because you will make mistakes. You are not perfect as a parent, and modeling that for your child is more important than them thinking that you're perfect. They don't think that, first of all. That's your imagination if you think they think that. They know you just as well as you know them. You can tell when they've done something wrong when they walk in the room. There's something about their demeanor or whatever it is you pick up on. Guess what? They can do the same thing with you. You know, another quote from Josh McDowell is, you can fool a fool, you can con a con, but you can't kid a kid. And that is so true. So that, again, the importance of that authenticity, being real, being genuine. And part of that is saying, hey, I'm sorry, I messed up here. I shouldn't have grounded you for 6 years. That was an overreaction. Stay in the present. Deal with whatever the issue is in the present. Try not to bring up the past, and that leads to the lectures and ongoing drawing it out, and they quit listening, you get more upset, they get defensive, and it's just a negative dynamic that happens. Again, empathy for emotions, accountability for behavior. That's kind of a summary of the grace and truth. So, what I want to do now is I want you to stop for just a minute, and even on your piece of paper there, I want you to think about the best boss or best teacher that you ever had. And what were the characteristics of that boss, that teacher, that caused you to want to go the extra mile and do whatever they ask you to do? What were some of the characteristics of that best teacher, best boss?
The requests were really clear.
Clear request, no confusion.
Calibrated questions that make you think about the whole picture and not just answering your question, but kind of coming back with questions, making that whole thing. So.
Yeah, helping you think through the process, through questions, rather than just giving directions sometimes. What about listening? Do they listen to you, or do they do all the talking? Were they polite or were they rude? Did they have realistic expectations or unrealistic expectations? Now I want you to think about the worst boss or worst teacher you ever had, that you just did not want to do. You might just do it because you had to, but you didn't want to, and you resented it. What were the characteristics of that person?
Biased.
I'm sorry, what?
They're biased.
Bias.
Favoritism.
Yeah, might have favorites. Yeah, I can think of a person like that.
Often they were vague and distant.
Vague, yeah. Unclear. Sometimes have the rule du jour. Today it's this rule, tomorrow it's another rule, and the next day it's another rule. The inconsistency, the unpredictability of it. Don't listen very well. Critical rather than affirming. Jared? Distant. Yeah. You don't feel like they're connected to you. They don't feel like they really have an interest in you. They're just kind of going through the motions in a very mechanical way.
The big part is when someone's invested in your success or not, like giving you opportunities to have leadership as well, and provide those moments of failure.
Yeah. They give you the opportunity to take on the leadership role, to make decisions, to propose ideas. And this is really important. I'll give you an example with my daughter. She was in gymnastics, and she was going once a week, and so they asked her to join this team. And when she joined the team, then she would work out 5 to 8 Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday, and 4 to 6 on Friday. Now, my daughter was a great student. She worked really hard, but she had to work to get her grades. And math was not her strength. I would spend hours at night trying to help her with the math. And of course, she would tell me I was stupid, that I didn't teach it the way the teacher taught it, and the normal back and forth that we do with parents and teens. And so she really wanted to join this team, and I had this concern of what's going to happen to her grades. And I said to her, I said, you're struggling in some subjects right now. What's going to happen if you're in the gym this much? Dad, I promise you, it'll work. I'll make it work. So we came up with a plan, and I built in a safety net that as long as she maintained the same grade she had, 1C, she was an AB student, 1C, that she could stay on the team. But if she had 2 C's, then she would have to be off the team. So she starts, and all of a sudden, every afternoon her homework is done. She had better study habits when she graduated from high school than I ever thought about having, because it was important to her. Suddenly she didn't need my help as much, and her grades actually came up. And so I was anxious, and if I had done it my way, I would not have given her that opportunity. I would have let my anxiety make the decision. But we kind of reached this agreement, and she did it, and she did great in gymnastics, and then her grades came up, and no problems. She never had to quit gymnastics, and I didn't have to argue with her near as much about math. So that was really nice for me. And then late middle school, I guess it was, she competed down in South Florida and didn't do quite as well as she wanted to, and decided that she wasn't going to the Olympics and was not going to go do gymnastics in college, and decided to quit. You sure this is what you want? You don't want to give it a little time? You're coming off of a bad beat? Nope. Been thinking about it. And she did, and moved on. But listen to your kids, and if there's a chance it will work, give it a chance. That leadership that you're talking about is so important. So, this is a list that I came up with that you can take a look at. Listening versus talking too much, predictable versus unpredictable, polite versus rude, positive and praises versus negative and critical, expects success versus expects failure, calm versus explosive, mistakes they teach, mistakes they scold, patient and perfectionistic. Now, the question becomes, which way do you parent? As your best boss or your worst boss? Remember, the goal is to create that relationship so that when you ask them to do something, you've got some sense of cooperation. It's easier if you have that relationship to get your child to comply. And so you have to spend some time working on the relationship. If you just approach it from strictly a behavior management, that's the truth part of it, and that's important. But if you don't include the grace, then you're probably going to get rebellion. And then you end up getting defensive, yelling. Your child gets defensive, they yell, and pretty soon you've got this significant conflict. I had planned on more questions. So do you have questions at this point? Yes. Here. Thanks, Jared.
I felt like one of the things you said, you're kind of like a fly on the wall of my house. My oldest does whatever I say, super compliant, no problems at all. And then my middle son is ADHD, and the middle school years, like everything I say is difficult. And like the planner example, that's literally something we did. But the struggle I have is when I have a consequence like that for him, like consequences mean nothing to him. And I mean, we've done classes and therapies, and nothing gets through. Like you say, take the electronics. His TV's been off his wall for years, and I'm not kidding. And I mean, I take every sports, anything you can think of away, and even rewards. Like let him pick the reward, and nothing works. But my other kids, it's just like you say. Like you give them rules, consequences. I'm almost wasting my time trying to do things because nothing seems to phase it. So I just didn't know what your suggestions would be for something like that.
Two things that I would suggest is prayer and perseverance. ADHD is a much more challenging disorder than people understand. Unfortunately, when you look at long-term outcomes as adults for ADHD, they're not real pretty. And the problem is executive functions associated with ADHD, specifically working memory. And working memory is not the inability to remember things, it's an inability to apply what you know. So it's an application deficit. Years ago, I was working with a young man and had anger problems, and we had just had a session, and he could have taught a workshop on anger management. He knew it backwards and forward. Walked out of the office, into the parking lot, had a meltdown, and never used any of the things we talked about. So that's part of what you're dealing with. And it is important to continue to be consistent. You're right on when you say it's hard to find consequences that are significant to them. So and I don't remember what he did, but took everything away. And that's never a good sign. So I walk in there to see what's going on. He's got Lincoln Logs that he played with when he was 6 years old, building, and perfectly happy. So because they're so in the moment, they can entertain themselves. They can play with a ball of dust and entertain themselves. So it is extremely difficult to find consequences that are significant. And you just try to be creative and come up with the things and understand. One of the things I think is really important is using short-term consequences with the idea of what do you need to do to get back into normal routine, so that you're trying to program the positive behavior, not just eliminate the negative. And that's something really important with parenting, is you want to think about what you want your child to look like and train them toward that. My major professor in college had a saying that has stuck with me. If a dead man can do it, it's not a good goal. A dead man is not depressed. He doesn't use drugs. He's not anxious, but he doesn't have much of a life. And one of my complaints with mental health is we focus so much on the negative and really need to one of the things I tried to do with patients when I worked with them was set positive goals. What do you want your life to look like? And where are we trying to go? So it is challenging with ADHD. And the things that we see work is medication, and working with the medical person on the timing of the medication is really important, so that you have the benefit of trying to do homework under the influence of medication. I mean, it's a real deal. It's very biological. It is not a psychological issue. It is a biological issue. But just being consistent, I think, is important. So my son, he was a lot smarter than I was, which made me mad because he didn't have to study. I was accused of being a perfectionist because I expected him to do homework in high school. He still graduated with a good GPA, got scholarships, went off to University of Central Florida, and about 3/4 away the first term, he said, "Dad, I need to come home." He had all Fs. Wasn't going to class, wasn't doing anything bad. Was going to parties, but he was taking his Yoo-hoos and drinking, and was known as the Yoo-hoo guy at parties. So he wasn't doing anything really bad. He just wasn't going to class, wasn't studying, just hard to motivate himself, which is, ADHD is more than just inattention and so forth. It is also the difficulty in motivating yourself. And so came home, went to UWF, and graduated, not with the best GPA, kind of had to take a job that wasn't what he really wanted to do, and then got into medical sales, was doing really well. By the way, if you have an ADHD kid, try to get them into sales. They do really well. And so the company closed, and he was supposed to go to work as a financial planner. And he called me and the day before he was going to start his training, and he said, "Dad, I've decided that God is calling me to the seminary." And so he went to the seminary, and he's now a student pastor. 3 years, and he learned. He only took 3 courses every semester at the seminary, because if he took more, it would get overwhelming, he would get distracted, and so forth. So it took him longer to get through. About 3 years into it, he said to me one day, he said, "You know, Dan, it just dawned on me the other day, I've never completed a whole book." 3 years into seminary, he's making good grades, A's and B's, and he hasn't completed a whole book. So I understand your world, and welcome to my world. But you do persevere. You keep emphasizing it. These are the rules. These are the consequences. And at some point, it does seem to click. And with him, I was convinced that one day he would find his passion, and he would do just fine. But he had to make sure it was something he was passionate about. If it was something he wasn't interested in, you could bribe him, you could beat him, you could punish him, you could use electricity to try to shock him. Nothing was going to work. I hope that helps in whatever way. I mean, that's just the reality of dealing with an ADHD individual.
I'd like to maybe hear you speak on prayer and around the story that you told with your daughter's idea that you kind of got behind and empowered, let go of your anxiousness, and really, like at that period, kind of relying on God being the strength and the director, and maybe even all the way as far as our children not being really our children, but His, and we're kind of the stewards of them, and taking the anxiety away through that.
Absolutely. When you get anxious, what do you try to do? You try to control everything. We're going to talk about next week, what's the most dangerous animal on earth? A scared parent. When we get scared, we get crazy. And we try to control things. And at that moment, we don't recognize the sovereignty of God and that God is in control and we're not. And that's a hard thing when it's your kids. I can give up a lot of things. I can give up control of your kids. But it's real hard for me to give up control of my kids because I'm so invested in that. And so I think that's one of the spiritual battles that we have to embrace, is sometimes I can't control everything, no matter how much I want to. And that's all areas of our lives. God, I want you to, send me to the Caribbean as a missionary. Don't send me to some poor third world country. We're not in control of that. And so it is important to be able to surrender and recognize you can't control everything. If you try to control everything, you're going to drive yourself and your child crazy. And you will not prepare them for being independent. I see parents who control every decision their child makes and tries to protect them from everything. And those kids make it through high school, do really well, but they go to college, and when they have to make decisions on their own, they don't do so well. They're used to somebody making decisions for them, so they find a peer group and let the peer group make decisions for them. And things don't go well then. And so it's a balance. I mean, again, there's that tension we've talked about. There's not a clear cut, let your child do everything they want to. Don't ever say no to them. Don't recommend that. There's a parenting out there, don't say no. There's a book to that effect. Don't agree with that. If you're about to run out in the middle of a road and a car is coming, I'm going to say no real loud. There are things you do to set guardrails for your kids to keep them inside, because if you don't, sometimes they may go over the edge. So, absolutely, we have to be able to surrender and recognize we cannot control everything. You have a responsibility to do the best you can as a parent. Spend time with your child. Set an example for your child. Hold your child accountable. That's your responsibility. And even when sometimes you question whether it's not working, you may try something new, but you may say, no, I don't see anything else that I think would work that's worth trying. And you just have to persevere. There's a lot in Scripture about perseverance and the benefit of that. We keep going. Sometimes Isaiah talks about soaring on wings like eagles and then running the race and finishing it. And sometimes just being able to walk. And that's kind of the way you're going to feel as a parent. Sometimes you're going, I got this. This is a piece of cake. And then you're going to just kind of be moving along. Then sometimes it's like, man, I don't have a clue what I'm doing. But persevere. Keep doing the things that you really believe are right. Any other questions?
That's a big blessing with.
Hang on just a minute.
Oh, sure.
We're recording this, by the way, as part of the reason we're asking you to use a microphone. I can hear you, but
Noticed a blessing with a 17. First of all, thank you very much for speaking. It was a very good presentation, so thank you.
thank you.
I have a 17-year-old and a 13-year-old, and I've noticed kind of just the amazing blessing of questions. I want to know how you recommend applying kind of a Socratic method or a teaching method through questions, especially as children get older, to kind of let them comprehend the consequences of their decisions and the reasoning behind their actions and behaviors.
Yeah, I think that's really important, especially in the teenage years. Now, I do emphasize and recommend that discussion not take place during discipline. When you are disciplining, you are setting some boundaries and limits, and believe it or not, kids will try to change the subject. And so you want to stick to the issue at hand, staying in the present. But I heard a great example. I guess it was this morning I was listening to something. And it's a pastor who was talking about what he allows his kids to watch and movies and things like that. And so he's not super strict on it. I mean, he monitors it and has some things. He watches it with them, and then he asks a question. What does this glorify? Does it glorify God? Does it glorify sex? Does it glorify physical attributions? Does it glorify fame? Does it glorify money? What is glorified in this process? What's important to you in having those discussions? But I think questions like that are really valuable to have those interactions with your kid. You want to have interaction with your kid. Please don't hear me that you don't, you cut them off and so forth. When you're disciplining, I think you do that. You have these conversations at other times. My son, I have a lot of stories about my son, and I have his permission to use these stories. So, but he was probably 7 in that area, and we'd had a lot of deaths in our family. Several uncles and an aunt. And so, very appropriately, he was thinking about death. And so, go in one night to put him to bed, and he said, Dad, I'm thinking a lot about death, and it's hard not to think about it. And so we talked about it and process the number, we had recent deaths and all these kinds of things. And so then the next night, Dad, I'm still thinking about death. And about 5 nights into it, it dawned on me, the only time we're having this conversation is bedtime. And so I said to him, I said, look, this is a really important topic, and we don't have time at night when you're going to bed to talk about it. Tomorrow afternoon, instead of going out to play, stay in and you and Mom can talk about it. Never heard about death anymore. Now, it started out as a legitimate issue, but he learned he could use that. He didn't like going to bed, ADHD, he learned he could use that topic to delay going to bed. And so you have to be aware of those things, and that's the reason I say sometimes you got to make sure the conversation is not having some type of secondary reinforcement that's unhealthy. Kids for attention will do a lot of things. They will fabricate things, create crisis, whatever. And so there are times where you need to listen, but if it's around discipline and all of a sudden that's the only time the issue comes up, be careful. So, but yeah, it is important to ask those questions of, what did you think about this movie? Or what do you think about this song? Or why do you like this person? What is it about this person that you really are interested in? And helping them identify what it is they value. And then share with them your thoughts. And, if they say, well, you disagree with me, yeah, we can disagree. I still love you. I still care about you. You believe this. I believe this. And have that conversation. Just because we disagree in beliefs doesn't mean we can't get along. That's part of the grace and truth. And so modeling that, I think, is really important. You had a question, I believe?
Thank you so much. My question is, well, I have a 3.5 and a 19-month-old. And so I'm a new mom, but I've decided to homeschool my 3.5-year-old. I know I met with a handful of homeschool moms, and they're telling me, it's such a young age, do like more activities with them, but I want to start to set a lesson plan. And I know it doesn't have to be an all-day schooling, it can be just an hour a time. But lately, he's been really testing my patience because he is a little bit more defiant, and I know it's the age, he's gained a little bit more independence, and he has more opinions, and so it's like the teenage years, and so they tell me it's one of the toughest years. So I'm just trying to understand, how can I navigate our relationship to where it's like, okay, I'm going to start putting lesson plans, because I feel like right now it's just very disorganized with activity and trying to teach him some, his ABCs and 1, 2, 3s. Can you just give me some advice on how I can transition into that with a 3.5-year-old?
Yeah. Understand each child is going to mature at a different rate. And so if you're having a lot of failures in your activities, may mean they're not ready for it. For example, potty training. Some kids just are not ready at 2, 3 years old, and some are later. My daughter, she was in the 1st grade and was having difficulty reading. And she had an incredible teacher who had a background in library science, so was really into reading, fortunately. And she told me, she says, she's just immature. She was one of the younger ones in her class. And she said, in the 2nd or 3rd grade, she's going to catch up and she'll be just fine. Said, you don't need to do anything. You don't need to label her as learning disability or anything like that. And so, sure enough, 3rd grade, she moved into the red reading group, whatever it was, the advanced reading group, and did just fine. But it was a matter of the biological maturity. And so just making sure that your daughter is at that point where she's ready for whatever activity. Attention span. Some kids just don't have a very long attention span at that time period. We have a lot of debate about at what age do kids really start learning from behavior management too. And part of it is kind of that working memory. Do they remember? One of the problems with ADHD is you could do a behavior management in this room, go into another room, and it wouldn't work. And so you can't ignore maturity, developmental status, the biological aspects of each individual child as well. So especially at that age and immaturity, if she's really having problems and it seems to be more than just behavioral, just be patient and give it a little bit of time. It's like I said, it's like potty training. Some kids just aren't ready. They need another 6 months before they're really ready for it. And so that aspect of doing an assessment of your child, it's really important to look at these developmental, biological aspects of it. Not everything is motivational and psychological. So I hope that helps.
Thank you.
Sorry, me again. I have one other question. So if you have, like for your son, for example, for kids that are a little more challenging, what are the top few behaviors you would focus on? Because for me, everything, like waking up, brushing your teeth, every single thing is a battle. But instead of, like, this makes me think of it like I kind of fall into the right-hand side of the worst things if I try to attack everything. So what are the top couple things that you would recommend focusing on?
Well, first of all, that's not my decision to make. That's your decision as a parent of what's important to you. I will emphasize that it is important to pick your battles. My daughter, when she was in, I think, late middle school, high school, got up every morning, made her bed. We had kind of set that as an expectation, so she would go to school. We went to her college dorm. Her roommate talked about every morning before she goes to class, she made her bed. She was in the habit. We were going to do the same thing with our son. That lasted about 3 weeks. It was not worth the battle. You have to make sure that it is important enough and that the energy required is worth it. And sometimes it's just not. You may want it. You would love to have it. You can try some behavioral things like if he won't get up in the morning, what that means is he's not getting enough sleep. So if you don't get up at such and such time, then we're going to move your bedtime back 30 minutes and some behavioral things like that. You can try it. Now, and part of the problem is some of these kids really, their sleep cycles, they get into these deep stages of sleep. It is very difficult for them to wake up. That's the problem with bedwetting, and it's not a bedwetting issue, it's a sleep issue. They get into these deep cycles of sleep and they're not aware of physical cues, and so you got to figure out how you modify that, and that's hard to do. But so, to me, it was school and just general compliance. That if I ask you to do something, I expect you to do it. However, I was very careful about what I asked to do and measured whether or not I felt like I could get compliance, had at least a shot at it. And if not, then we'd give a warning and say, if you don't do it now, this is the consequence. And if you just persevere with that and then make sure, and we'll talk about the behavior management, the third session, we'll talk about reinforcers and what's reinforcing and so forth.